what's the Catholic Church position on SOCE therapies and homosexuality in general?
Yeah, the Catholic Church believes fundamentally that sex relations should only be between a man and a woman in a lifelong marriage commitment. Any other sexual expression outside of that is considered to be deficient in morality, maybe sinful, depending on the other circumstances involved. So the Catholic Church holds that persons who are attracted to persons of the same sex, the attraction itself is not sinful, but it's an attraction to engage in behavior that is definitely sinful. So it's an occasion of sin. It's called an intrinsic disorder. Disorder meaning that it's drawing me to do something that I shouldn't be doing. Intrinsic means that it's inside myself. And as far as I know, the Catholic Church doesn't take any position on any kind of therapy one way or another, except that it strongly upholds the principle of autonomy, that people should have the freedom to go see what therapist they want to see and to define what goals they want in therapy, not to have those goals defined or imposed upon them by some larger body, and particularly not by a secular government.
Besides being a priest, you are also a professor of sociology, so you have an insight into the latest social science research. What is the impact on a child's development and later life of being raised by same-sex parents?
I've done a lot of research in this area, and most of the research that you'll read is biased, is really untrue. We have many LGBT committees in our professional associations that screen out research and move research toward a homophile conclusion that children have no difference whether they're raised with same-sex parents or opposite-sex parents. But in my research, I have found that this is not true. I have studied children with same-sex parents in the largest public health survey in the world, the National Health Interview Survey of the United States, using over 2 million cases. And what I found was that the children with two parents of the same sex had about twice the rate of emotional problems compared to children who were raised with man-woman parents. I also found in subsequent studies that if the two parents of the same sex of these children were married, there was greater harm than if they were not married. So we have some interesting kind of pushback research with regard to the outcomes for children with same-sex parents.
And what is worse, an orphanage or same-sex parents?
It depends on the orphanage, and it depends on the parents. It's not an absolute difficulty in my mind if a child is with same-sex parents. There are worse things, right? We have a lot of single parents, and often people say, well, would it be better to grow up with only one parent or with two parents of the same sex? The answer would be only one parent in that case. But with regard to an orphanage, it really it depends a lot on the circumstances. The important point in adoption that's often lost in these discussions is that the fundamental principle should be what is the best interest of that child. Not what's the interest of the parents, not for them to have a child to show off and to show how wonderful they are, not to fulfill themselves as persons in some way, but it's what is the best interest of that child. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a child and the child has no relative other than a same-sex person that's in a relationship with another same-sex person. Well, we know that children that are placed with relatives do better than children who are placed with strangers. So in that case, it might be better for them to go with someone in the family, even though it's someone in a same-sex relationship, than with a stranger who was in a heterosexual relationship. It's a judgment call, and you have to take lots and lots of factors into account. I have two adopted children myself, and before we were permitted to adopt, we went through extensive home studies that looked at the nature of our relationship as a married couple, that looked at our financial stability, that looked at our other children, all kinds of factors in our lives, and then made a decision based on what's in the best interest of that child. And I think that should factor into any adoption decision. Another factor that is not at all considered when considering adoption is that we know that children who are raised by same-sex parents are more likely to become homosexual themselves. And they're more likely to go through a time of questioning their sexuality. Now, if you have a child that is a heterosexual child, would it make more sense to put that child with same-sex parents or with heterosexual parents? If you have a boy, you don't know whether at age 4 or 5 or he's going to be heterosexual or homosexual, but over 95% of the time he's going to be heterosexual. So would you put him in a family with 2 mothers so that he wouldn't have the influence of a father growing up? If you have a child that you know is going to be homosexual, then you would want to place a child with a family that's like he's going to be. That might make sense. But if you don't know anything else, it seems like it would be harmful, might cause complications to a child who is likely to grow up heterosexual, to place that child with homosexual parents before he or she has a chance even to explore their natural biological sexuality. So all of these things I think should be taken into consideration for the best interest of the child.
Is homosexuality genetically determined, or it is more a result of environment and social influences?
There is a small genetic influence on homosexuality. The best research that we have comes to a consensus that about 1/3 of the difference in sexual orientation can be accounted for by genetics, and 2/3 would be accounted for by environment. So it's mostly environmental. It is certainly not something that someone is genetically determined to do. A year and a half ago, there was a study that came out in the journal Science that was a genome-wide association study, the first large such study of sexual orientation. And this is superior to all of the twin studies, because instead of comparing twins to see if the difference between monozygotic and dizygotic twins has anything to do with the heritability of homosexuality, they were actually able to look directly at people's genomes and to see if the genetic structure of persons who were attracted to persons of the same sex was different than that of persons who were attracted to persons of the opposite sex. And what they found was that there was no genetic difference between them. And they concluded, published this in the New York Times, they said, the search for a gay gene has ended. There is no gay gene. Not only is there no gay gene, said these researchers, no one will ever find a gay gene because their conclusions preclude the possibility of there being a strong unilateral genetic component for homosexuality. Well, this is not too surprising for people who do research in this area. The American Psychological Association, as well as the British Royal College of Surgeons, have both in the last 5 to 7 years softened their stance about the genetic component of homosexuality to say, from a statement saying, well, it's definitely genetically determined, to saying it's a mix of factors and we don't know for sure exactly where it comes from. So this, the popular view is slowly catching up with the science. But the science is very clear that there really is no strong genetic determination with regard to a person's sexual orientation. We also know that people change their sexual orientation throughout their lifetime. If you interview a group of men at age 18, and then you interview that same group of men at age 35, you'll find that better than half of them who at 18 said, I only have sex with men, have by age 35 said, no, I'm married, or I only have sex with women. And so it falls off. How can it be genetic if it disappears after a while? You know, a true genetic trait doesn't reverse itself. If a man has male pattern baldness and goes bald, he doesn't start growing his hair back after a while because it's a true genetic trait. So it's not possible. We also know that there's, lots of environmental factors that affect sexual expression, especially with regard to men. For instance, men who are incarcerated in jails or penitentiaries tend to practice homosexuality at a much higher rate than the general population. And when they leave, they often leave the homosexuality and they go back to having sex with women because for a while women are not available. So they adapt to that. Well, how can that be if it's a genetic trait? It's a situational trait for sure in that setting. So there are lots of reasons not to believe the popular myth that somehow someone is born that way.
As a priest, do you experience any impacts of the LGBTQ lobby within the church?
Not much in the church. The church is kind of clear about these issues. We do have, of course, a lot of homosexual priests, and we have this horrible problem of sexual abuse of children. And so sometimes, we get tarred with that. All priests somehow are seen to be homosexual offenders. But I think that's good for my spirituality to be denigrated and sometimes looked down upon, and I just accept that and offer that up to God. I think the Catholic Church has not dealt as forthrightly with this issue as it should. And the biggest problem we have is our church leaders, our bishops and other higher leaders who seem to be very soft, very non-responsive on this issue.